The sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline when the dust began to rise. It was the 27th day of July in the year 1302, and the plain of Bapheus lay east of Nicomedia like a cracked and sunburned palm, flat and unforgiving beneath the hammer of an Anatolian summer. The air tasted of iron and dried grass, the kind of morning that sticks to your skin before you have even risen from the ground. Somewhere in the distance, the waters of the Gulf of Nicomedia glittered silver and indifferent, as if history itself had not yet decided to show up. But it was coming. God, it was coming fast. From the west, threading through the dust and the heat shimmer, a Byzantine column advanced, perhaps 2,000 men in total, armoured in the old imperial way, their shields painted in the faded colours of an empire that had ruled these lands for 1,000 years. They moved like a tired silver serpent dragging itself across burning sand, still dangerous, still armed, but slower than it once was, slower than it needed to be. Their commander, the Megas Heteriarches George Mouzalon, rode at their head, knowing that he had set out with far more men than this. The rest had simply vanished, deserted, melted back into the countryside, taken what they could carry, and gone home to their families. What remained was half an army. Maybe less than half, if you counted the Alan mercenaries who rode in sullen silence on the flanks, men who had been promised payment and had received promises instead. Waiting for them, though the Byzantines did not yet know this, was something altogether different. On the slopes and in the hollows east of the plain, crouched in the dry brush and behind the rises of ground that broke the otherwise flat terrain, 5,000 horsemen waited, with the stillness of men who understood patience the way a predator understands it, not as a virtue, as a weapon. They were the army of Osman, son of Ertugrul, Bey of the Kai Turks, and on this morning they were about to deliver a blow from which the greatest empire in the Christian world would never fully recover. 2,000 against 5,000. Half of those 2,000 already half committed to leaving. One man who had chosen this ground against another, who was walking into it blind. But numbers and terrain only tell you the shape of a story. They do not tell you the weight of it. Because what happened on this burned and forgotten plain on this particular summer morning was not simply a battle between Byzantine soldiers and Ottoman cavalry. It was the collision of two worlds, one ancient and magnificent and exhausted, the other young and hungry and absolutely certain of its own destiny. One empire reaching the end of a millennium, another one just drawing its first breath. The tactical stakes were clear enough. If Mouzalon's force was destroyed, Nicomedia would starve. The city was already half dead, cut off from its harvest, its countryside stripped bare by Ottoman raiders who moved through Bithynia as freely as water moves through broken stone. A relief column was the only thing standing between the city and surrender. But the strategic stakes were bigger than one city. Bithynia, or the entire northwest corner of Anatolia, the last buffer between the Byzantine heartland and the advancing Turkic frontier, hung in the balance. Lose Bithynia, and Constantinople itself would begin to feel the shadow of something new and terrible pressing against it from the east. And the civilizational stakes? Those were bigger still. So much bigger that the men on both sides could not possibly have understood them on that dusty morning, because what was truly at stake on the plain of Bapheus was the answer to a question that would define the next 600 years of human history. Would there be an Ottoman Empire at all? This battle changed everything, not gradually, not over decades. On this single morning, in the space of a few brutal hours, the Byzantine Empire lost Asia Minor forever, and a small, semi-nomadic principality from the borderlands of Bithynia became something that would one day swallow Constantinople, spread across 3 continents, and endure until the 20th century. The dust was rising, the serpent was moving, and the trap was already set. To understand what happened at Bapheus, you have to understand what the world looked like in the year 1302. And the world, in 1302, looked like it was falling apart. Start 250 years before the battle. In 1071, on a plain called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, a Byzantine army under the Emperor Romanos IV rode out to stop a Seljuk Turkish force under Sultan Alp Arslan. What followed was a catastrophe so total, so unexpected, so humiliating that Byzantine writers would still be trying to explain it a century later. The emperor was captured. His army was destroyed. And the door to Anatolia, the great agricultural heartland that fed the empire, the plateau that had anchored Byzantine power for 7 centuries, was kicked open so hard that it never fully closed again. Waves of Turkic settlers and warriors poured through the gap. Cities that had been Greek-speaking for 1,000 years gradually became Turkish. The old Roman roads fell silent. The great interior of Anatolia, which had once been the most densely administered region of the empire, began its slow transformation into something utterly different. But Manzikert was only the beginning of the unravelling. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, launched theoretically to recover Jerusalem, made a catastrophic and cynical detour and sacked Constantinople itself. Christian crusaders looting a Christian capital. The empire fractured into successor states, the largest of which, the Empire of Nicaea, eventually reconquered Constantinople in 1261 under Michael VIII, Palaiologos. Byzantium was restored, but it was not the same empire that had fallen. It was smaller, poorer, more suspicious of its western neighbours, less capable of projecting the kind of power it had once wielded with casual confidence across the eastern Mediterranean. And then came the second wave of destruction from the east. In 1243, at the Battle of Köse-Dağ, the Mongols under the Ilkhanate crushed the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum so thoroughly that the Sultanate never recovered. Within a generation, the Seljuk state had dissolved into a constellation of smaller principalities and the beyliks, each one ruled by a local Turkish chieftain, who owed nominal loyalty to the Mongol overlords, but in practice did as he pleased. Anatolia became a patchwork of these petty kingdoms, each competing with the others, each raiding, trading, fighting, praying and surviving as best it could in the chaos that the Mongol conquest had created. Warriors displaced from the east by Mongol violence poured into the borderlands. Dervishes and Sufi mystics wandered the new frontier, giving spiritual weight to whatever strongman would listen. Ghazi warriors, i.e. men who had devoted their lives to holy war on the frontiers of Islam, attached themselves to whichever bey seemed most likely to provide them with what they wanted: action, plunder, land, and glory. Into this fractured, violent, endlessly contested landscape, one man had been quietly building something different. Osman does not arrive in history with a trumpet blast. He arrives like weather, a gradual shift in pressure that you only notice when the storm is already upon you. He sat on his horse on the edges of Byzantine Bithynia in the early 1280s, a young chieftain who had just inherited leadership of his Kayu clan from his father Ertugrul, and he looked at the old empire across the frontier with the calculating gaze of a man who has nothing to lose and everything to gain. He was not an idealist. He was not primarily a religious zealot, though the language of holy war gave shape and legitimacy to everything he did. He was a pragmatist, a builder, a man who understood, in a way that none of his neighbours quite seemed to, that raids were temporary and kingdoms were permanent, and that the difference between the two was simply the decision to stay. Where other beys struck and retreated, Osman struck and settled. Where others took plunder back to camp, Osman took land and administered it. He allied with Sheikh Edebali, a revered Sufi cleric whose daughter he would eventually marry. And through that alliance, he secured the loyalty of the brotherhood networks that threaded through every town and village in the borderlands. He recruited Turkmen from Paphlagonia, absorbing clan after clan into a growing coalition that was beginning to look less like a raiding band and more like the skeleton of a state. He chose his targets carefully, Byzantine border fortresses and frontier towns, rather than the well-defended larger cities, because the border was where the empire was weakest and he was strongest. He won enough small victories to build a reputation, and reputation on that frontier was the hardest currency of all. By 1299, Osman was strong enough to declare his principality independent of whatever remained of Seljuk authority, which by then was mostly theoretical anyway. He began having his name read in the Friday prayers, the traditional signal that a Muslim ruler considered himself sovereign. He stopped paying tribute to anyone. He was, in every practical sense, his own man and his own state, commanding a territory that included the important town of Sout and extended to the edges of Byzantine Bithynia on every side. And then, in 1301, he pushed hard enough to encircle Nicaea itself. This was not a small thing. Nicaea, the city the Byzantines still called their former capital, the city where the great ecumenical council had defined Christian orthodoxy, the city that symbolized everything the empire hoped it still was now ringed by Ottoman forces. Byzantine farmers could not reach their fields. Byzantine tax collectors could not move through the countryside. The ancient city began to starve slowly, and the government in Constantinople began to panic. Now look at who was sitting in Constantinople when all this was happening. Andronicus II, Palaiologos, emperor since 1282, a man whom historians have described with the particular cruelty that history reserves for those who inherit great problems and fail to solve them, as a theologian on a military throne. He was intelligent. He was pious. He wrote extensively on matters of church doctrine. What he was not, and had never been, was a military commander or a strategic thinker capable of meeting the kind of challenge that Osman represented. He had, within the first years of his reign, done something that Byzantine commentators would spend decades trying to explain. He had reduced the army and disbanded the navy. The empire that had once fielded tens of thousands of professional soldiers and patrolled the Aegean with a powerful fleet now relied on a handful of cavalry, some mercenary contingents, and the goodwill of Genoese merchants for its maritime defence. Unemployed Byzantine sailors, denied their livelihood, went to work for the very Turkish emirs who were now raiding the Aegean islands. This was the empire that needed to stop Osman. In the spring of 1302, Andronicus launched two parallel counter-offensives, the last serious attempt the Byzantine government would make to hold Anatolia. His son and co-emperor Michael IX marched south toward Magnesia with the larger force. George Mousillon crossed the Bosphorus toward Nicomedia with the smaller one. The plan was reasonable on paper. Two prongs, two threats addressed simultaneously, the empire reasserting itself in its own backyard. But armies are not made of paper. Michael IX reached Magnesia, and then, without fighting a single battle, his army began to fall apart. The native Byzantine contingents deserted, one unit at a time. The Alan mercenaries requested permission to withdraw. Michael himself, looking at what remained of his force, and calculating that attacking Osman with half an army was worse than not attacking at all, retreated by sea. He sailed back to Constantinople, bringing with him a wave of Greek Christian refugees who had seen what was coming and decided they would rather leave than wait for it. Mousillon, meanwhile, was already across the strait. He was already in Anatolia. He had already lost most of his force to desertion, men who plundered Byzantine settlements on the way, of all the bitter ironies, before slipping away into the countryside. What remained was roughly 2,000 soldiers. Half of them were Alans, tough and capable horsemen who had fled the Mongol advance and found employment in Byzantine service. But employment was not the same as loyalty, and the Alans had not been paid what they were promised. They rode with Muzalon's column, but they rode without enthusiasm, and everyone who looked at them knew it. A word about the sources. We know what we know about Bapheus, primarily through the Byzantine historian George Pachymeres, who lived from approximately 1242 to 1310, and who wrote about the events of Andronicus II's reign with the intimate frustration of a man who watched his world being dismantled and could not stop it. Pachymeres was not present at Bapheus, but he was close to the court, close to the men who were present, and he wrote his account with the detail and the bitterness that only genuine distress produces. Where his numbers are disputed, and they are by some modern scholars who place the battle in 1301 rather than 1302, and who argue about the exact size of the forces involved, the broad outlines of what happened are not seriously in doubt. The Byzantines came, the Ottomans were ready, and what followed changed the world. What we must acknowledge in the honest spirit of anyone who takes history seriously is that we are reading the loser's account. Pachymeres wrote from the perspective of a civilization that was losing. He had every reason to explain the defeat in terms that protected Byzantine dignity. Too few men, treacherous Alans, impossible odds, and every reason to minimize what Osman actually accomplished. When we read between the lines of his account, what we see is something more impressive and more frightening than even he was willing to fully admit. A man who had been preparing for this moment for 20 years. Who knew the ground he was fighting on, who had planted his trap with patience and closed it with speed, and who on this particular morning was simply better than the empire that had sent men to stop him. Nicomedia was starving. Nicaea was encircled. The relief column was coming, and Osman was waiting. The plain of Bapheus sits east of Nicomedia, today the city of Izmit, Turkey, sprawling along the eastern shore of its gulf, in a region that in 1302 was still nominally Byzantine, but was already beginning to feel the weight of a different future. The plain itself is not dramatic terrain. It does not inspire poetry. It is simply flat. Flat in the way that the aftermath of ancient geological violence is flat, smoothed and pressed by millennia into a long, low surface, broken only by gentle rises and shallow draws that could hide a man, a horse, 100 horses, if you knew where to look and had the patience to stay still. This is why Osman had chosen it. When you look at the plain from the perspective of a Byzantine commander approaching from the coast, it seems open and honest. There are no dramatic cliffs, no dark forests, no obvious ambush ground. The eye sweeps across it and sees nothing alarming. A cautious commander might send scouts. Muzalan did, but Ottoman scouts had been watching Byzantine scouts for years, and by 1302 they had refined the art of concealment on this particular terrain to something close to science. The hollows between the low hills could swallow hundreds of horsemen if those horsemen lay flat and kept their animals still. The dry brush and scrub oak on the slopes could hide the glint of armour if the men behind the armour knew what they were doing. They knew. To the west of the plain, perhaps 5 miles, the waters of the Gulf of Nicomedia offered the Byzantines their only secure line of retreat, back to the coast, back to the ships, back to Constantinople. But 5 miles is a long way when your army is disintegrating and men on horseback are faster than men on foot. Osman had thought about this. His deployment was not designed simply to defeat the Byzantine column. It was designed to destroy it, to cut off the retreat, to fold the flanks inward, to turn a tactical engagement into a rout, and a rout into a disaster. He had seen, in 20 years of frontier warfare, that the difference between a victory and a transformative victory was whether your enemy could run away and regroup. He did not want Muzalan to regroup. He wanted the Byzantine presence in the Bithynian countryside ended so completely that it would never come back. Consider what Osman brought to this fight. Approximately 5,000 riders. Not heavy cavalry in the Byzantine or Western European tradition. No expensive war horses, no full plate armour, no lances designed for massed shock charge. What Osman had was something altogether different, and, in this terrain, altogether more dangerous. His core force was the Kai tribal cavalry, men who had grown up on horseback in the steppes and semi-arid margins of Anatolia, who could ride all day and fight at the end of it, who carried compound bows and had been trained since childhood to shoot them accurately from a moving horse. Around this core were the Allied contingents he had absorbed over the previous decade. Warriors from Paphlagonia, Turkmen clans from the Meander Valley, and a growing number of Ghazi fighters who had heard about Osman and come specifically to be part of what he was building. These were not reluctant conscripts or underpaid mercenaries. These were men who had chosen to be here, who believed that what they were doing had both worldly and spiritual dimensions, who had families and futures riding on the success of this morning's work. Their weapons were designed for the kind of warfare they practiced. The composite bow, horn and sinew and wood, laminated together under tension, could be drawn and released from the saddle without breaking the rhythm of a gallop. It could penetrate Byzantine armour at short range. It was not as individually powerful as the great English longbow of the same era, but it did not need to be, because the men carrying it moved so fast and shot so often that the cumulative effect of their fire was devastating. Beyond the bows, they carried curved swords and short spears, weapons for the close-in work that followed when the archery had done its first terrible job. Their horses were smaller than the European war horses, leaner, with the particular endurance of animals bred for dry climates and long distances. They could change direction at speed in a way that heavier cavalry simply could not. And Osman himself moved among them the night before, visiting each contingent, each campfire, each cluster of men, sharpening weapons and checking bowstrings in the failing light. This is not recorded in Pachimirs, but it is recorded in who these men became. You do not build the kind of loyalty that turns a tribal raiding band into the foundation of an empire with speeches alone. You build it with presence, with recognition, with a small particular acknowledgement, a name remembered, a question about a brother, a hand briefly on a shoulder, that tells a man his commander sees him as a person and not a unit. Osman had been doing this for 20 years. By the night of July 26th, 1302, every man in his force knew exactly what the morning required and exactly why it mattered. Now, look at the other campfire. George Mouzalon was a capable soldier from a distinguished military family. He was not incompetent, he was not cowardly. He was the kind of officer who does everything correctly and still loses because the conditions he is operating in are not correctable by individual competence. He had been given an impossible mission with inadequate resources and explicit instructions not to retreat. He sat in his camp on the night before the battle, knowing that his force was less than half what he had started with, knowing that the Alans on his flanks were sullen and unpredictable, knowing that his infantry, the core of the Byzantine tactical system, had not been designed to fight the kind of mobile, dispersed, fast-moving cavalry engagement that Osman specialized in. He knew all of this, and he had been ordered forward anyway. The soldiers who sat around his campfires were not abstractions. There was among them a young man from a village in Bithynia itself, Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian, the son of a farmer whose land had been raided so many times in the past decade that he had given up trying to replant the fields in the burned sections. This young man had joined Mouzalon's force not out of imperial loyalty exactly, but out of the particular desperation of someone whose world is being taken away from him piece by piece, and who has decided that fighting back is better than watching it happen. He did not know Osman's name. He knew only that there were men on the other side of the plain who were going to take everything his family had left if he did not stop them. And on the other side of that same plain, a young Turkmen warrior from Paphlagonia had arrived at Osman's camp only 3 weeks earlier, drawn south by the stories that travelled faster than horses along the Anatolian trade routes. Stories of a bey who paid his men, who kept his promises, who fought the Byzantines and won, and then stayed to hold the ground instead of looping back to camp with the plunder. This young warrior had left behind a family that had been displaced twice by Mongol raids, once from their original pasture lands near the Caspian, once again from a second settlement that Mongol foragers had burned without explanation. He had nothing left to lose. He had everything left to find, and Osman's camp, with its discipline and its purpose and its forward momentum, felt like the first solid ground he had stood on in years. 2 young men, 2 campfires. The same night, sky over Anatolia, the same stars that had watched over this land since before either of their languages had names for constellations. Neither of them could see the other, neither of them knew the other existed. But in the morning, they would find each other on a flat plain east of a dying city, and one of them would determine the future of the other. This is what history is made of in the end, not the decisions of emperors and beys, though those matter, not the grand movements of armies on maps, but the particular, irreducible weight of individual human beings walking into a morning that will be the last morning of everything they have known, carrying everything they love on their backs, trusting that the ground beneath their feet will hold. The ground at Bapheus was Osman's ground. He had made sure of it. His plan was elegant in the way that effective plans always are, simple enough to survive contact with reality. A vanguard of perhaps 500 men would be visible to the approaching Byzantines, close enough to engage, small enough to invite aggression. When the Byzantines committed to attacking this vanguard, the main body would emerge from concealment on both flanks, simultaneously, encircling the Byzantine column before it could reform. The vanguard itself, once the flanking movement began, would turn and press back against the Byzantine front, 3 directions at once. The classic nomadic envelopment, refined over 1,000 years of steppe warfare and now being deployed against an enemy that had never quite found a way to counter it. Like a spider that retreats from the centre of its web, only to close it from all sides at once, there was no good direction to run, and every direction the Byzantines might choose would accelerate the collapse. The sun was not yet fully over the ridgeline, but it was getting there fast. The morning broke hot, not gradually hot, the way summer mornings sometimes ease themselves into warmth. Hot, immediately, viciously, the kind of heat that comes off the Anatolian plateau in late July, like a physical presence, pressing down on men and horses and armour until the sweat runs freely before the first step is taken. The dust was already rising where the Byzantine column moved, not the dramatic cloud of a full cavalry charge, but the low, persistent haze of 2,000 men and their horses and their equipment grinding through dry ground that had not seen rain in weeks. It hung behind them like a slow accusation, marking their position for anyone on the surrounding hills who cared to look. Osman's scouts had been watching since before dawn. Musalon rode at the head of his column, with the rigid composure of a man who has accepted that the situation is bad and that the only thing left to do is to manage it professionally. His scouts had reported Ottoman activity ahead, a relatively small force, perhaps a few hundred horsemen, visible near the Faujai the Ottomans had been besieging. The fort of Bapheus itself lay perhaps 2 miles ahead, a squat, Byzantine construction of cut stone that had been holding out against Ottoman pressure for weeks, but could not hold out much longer. Musalon's mission was to relieve it, to break through whatever resistance lay between his column and the fort, establish contact, resupply, and force the Ottomans to lift their siege. Simple, direct, the kind of operation that worked when your army was intact and your enemy was disorganized. But his army was not intact, and his enemy was very much organized. The plain opened before them as they left the last of the coastal scrub behind. Musalon looked out across it and saw what he had expected to see. Open ground, the distant smudge of the besieged fort, and ahead, perhaps a mile away, a line of perhaps 400 or 500 Turkish horsemen. Not many. Not enough to explain why his instincts were suddenly loud and insistent and impossible to silence. He sent scouts forward. They reported back. The force ahead was small, the ground between was open. There was no obvious sign of a larger force concealed anywhere in the vicinity. The scouts were wrong. Or rather, they had looked at the ground correctly, but had not understood what they were looking at. Musalon ordered the advance. The Byzantine column moved forward in the way that Byzantine armies had been moving forward for centuries. Infantry in the centre, cavalry on the wings, a measured pace that maintained cohesion and allowed the commanders to control what happened. The Alans rode on the right flank, watching the terrain with the particular wariness of men who had survived the Mongols and were not easily surprised by anything. The Latin mercenary cavalry rode on the left, competent and expensive, and at the moment principally interested in the fact that the morning was already very hot and they had been marching since before sunrise. 100 yards from the Ottoman vanguard, the Byzantine cavalry accelerated, and then something unusual happened. The Ottoman vanguard ran, not in disorder, not the wild scatter of men surprised and overwhelmed. They simply turned their horses, formed a loose group, and rode back the way they had come, at a canter that was fast enough to maintain distance, but slow enough to keep the Byzantines chasing. It was the kind of retreat that looks like flight and feels like victory, and it was exactly what Musalon's men had been hoping for. Byzantine cavalry surged forward, breaking from the column's pace, pursuing the retreating Turks with the momentum of men who believe they are winning. The silence that followed was a very specific kind of silence, not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of everything about to happen. For perhaps 30 seconds, the plain of Bapheus was perfectly, impossibly quiet. The pursuing cavalry were ahead. The main column was still moving, but had lost its leading edge. The Alans on the right flank had stopped moving entirely, their horses shifting uneasily, the riders looking at the slopes of the low hills to the north and east, with expressions that had moved from wariness to something colder and more specific. Then the slopes moved, not metaphorically, not gradually. The slopes of those low hills quite literally appeared to peel apart as 5,000 men and their horses rose from concealment simultaneously and began to move, and the sound of them, the hoofbeats and the war cries and the singing of bowstrings, hit the Byzantine column like a physical wave. The Ottoman main force had been so well hidden, so perfectly still, that even the Byzantine scouts had ridden within half a mile of them and seen nothing. Now they were everywhere. From the north, from the east, from the direction of the retreating vanguard, which was already wheeling to come back. From every direction that mattered, the Ottoman cavalry was coming. But the worst sound was the arrows. The Ottoman horse archers did not charge directly into the Byzantine line. They curved, they swept in arcs, maintaining the distance that kept them out of effective Byzantine reach, while closing the range for their own bows. The composite bow at 100 yards against Byzantine infantry armour was a lethal proposition. Not a guaranteed kill with every shot, but a steady, remorseless attrition that emptied saddles and dropped horses and punched through shield rims and found the gaps between armour plates with the patient statistical certainty of volume fire. They were not trying to win individual duels. They were trying to create chaos, and chaos was already winning. The Byzantine infantry, the tagmata at the centre of the column, locked shields and held. These were professional soldiers, men who had trained for exactly this kind of attack, and for the first few minutes they performed as trained. Shields up, spears levelled, maintaining the defensive formation that had blunted cavalry charges for centuries. But this was not a cavalry charge. It was a moving storm, and the storm did not commit to a single point of impact. It simply surrounded, it circled, it shot. Within the first quarter hour of the engagement, the horses of the Byzantine cavalry were taking the worst of it. Osman's archers had been instructed, and this reflects a tactical sophistication that deserves recognition, to prioritize targets that would create maximum disorder rather than maximum casualties. A dead horse is worth more than a dead rider in this kind of engagement. A dead horse creates an obstacle, panics other horses, dismounts the rider who was providing mobile protection to the infantry, and spreads the contagion of fear through an army that is already operating on the edge of its cohesion. The Byzantine cavalry on the left flank, the Latin mercenaries, began to lose horses in clusters. One horse goes down, screaming in that particular way that horses have, and every other horse within 50 yards knows it and responds to it, and the riders spend half their energy controlling animals that have forgotten their training and remembered their instincts. By noon, when the sun had climbed to its brutal apex, and the plain had reached the kind of heat that makes thinking difficult and breathing uncomfortable, the Latin cavalry on the left had begun to fragment. Not a single dramatic break. Men don't usually admit to themselves that they are running until they are already doing it, but a gradual, incremental drift to the left and back. A series of individual calculations that the situation was untenable, the pay was not sufficient for this particular morning, that the Bosphorus and Constantinople and cooler weather lay in the direction away from the Ottoman arrows. One rider, then 3, then a dozen, then 100. The left flank of the Byzantine column was dissolving. Musalon saw it happening and reacted with professional speed, swinging his attention to his right, to the Alans who were still formed and still capable. He sent a messenger, "Ride hard, tell the Alan commander to drive into the Ottoman northern flank, break the encirclement, give the infantry a corridor to retreat through." The messenger delivered the order, but the Alan commander looked at what was in front of him, and he made a calculation. 5,000 Ottoman cavalry, fresh and coordinated, and operating with an aggression that suggested absolute confidence in the outcome, versus his force, perhaps 800 or 900 riders, well armed, well mounted, but without the numbers to break through a force 5 times their size, even if every man committed fully, and not every man was going to commit fully. The Alans had not been paid. The Alans had watched the Latin cavalry dissolve on the other flank. The Alans had survived the Mongol conquest of the Caspian steppe by being very good at recognizing losing situations before those situations became fatal. The Alan commander did not attack. Musalon received word of this and went still for a moment, in the way that men go still when they have just understood something terrible and irreversible. The left was gone. The right was not moving. The infantry at the centre was taking fire from 3 sides and could not advance and could not retreat without order and coordination from cavalry that was no longer there to provide it. The vanguard of the Ottoman force, the 500 riders that had seemed to flee so easily at the start, was back now, pressing from the east, completing the circle that the flanking forces had begun. Around the Byzantine infantry, the Ottoman horsemen tightened their orbit, always moving, always shooting, never quite committing to the close-range melee that would allow the Byzantine spearmen to do what Byzantine spearmen did best. The Byzantines could not catch them. They could not hold them. They could only absorb. Somewhere in the middle of the Byzantine infantry, a man who might have been the young soldier from Bithynia was doing what you do when everything is going wrong around you. He was holding his spear, keeping his shield up, standing close enough to the man beside him that their armour touched, and trying not to think about the fact that the man who had been standing on his left 5 minutes ago was no longer standing there. The Byzantine army, at its best, was built on the understanding that no individual soldier had to win alone, that the collective discipline of the formation was the weapon, and the weapon worked as long as every part of it held. But the formation was cracking. Every arrow that punched through a shield, every horse that went down screaming, every man who turned and ran because he calculated that running was better than staying, each one was a fracture in the weapon that made the next fracture more likely. The cavalry that had initially pursued the Ottoman vanguard in the first minutes of the battle had now been almost entirely scattered. Some had turned and were riding hard for the coast. Some had been brought down by the arrow storm. A few brave or foolish men had actually closed to sword range with the Ottoman riders and were fighting in the churning close-quarters chaos that develops when a battle stops being organized and becomes personal. But there were too few of them to matter. Individual courage cannot substitute for collective cohesion, and the collective cohesion of the Byzantine force had been bleeding out since the first Ottoman arrow found its mark. Time was passing the way time passes in battle, simultaneously too fast and too slow. Fast, because things kept happening faster than they could be processed. Slow, because each second of standing under that storm of arrows, while the sun hammered down and the dust made it hard to breathe and the screaming of horses and men created a wall of sound that pressed in from all sides. Each second was its own terrible eternity. The afternoon had not yet come, but it felt like a lifetime since morning. Mousillon had been wounded. The sources are imprecise about when and how seriously, but Pachymers mentions it. And given the chaos of the engagement, it would have been more surprising if he had not been. He was still upright, still commanding, still trying to impose order on a situation that had long since passed beyond the reach of orders. He could see, with the clarity that comes from having run out of options, exactly what needed to happen. The infantry needed a corridor to withdraw toward Nicomedia. The Alans were the only force still intact enough to create that corridor. The Alans had to move. He rode to the Alan commander himself. This is not in Pachymers with certainty, but it is the logical consequence of everything the historian does record, and it has the quality of something that actually happened. Mousillon, wounded, his army disintegrating around him, riding through the storm to find the one man who could still change the outcome and making his case in person. Whatever was said between them, the result was this. The Alans agreed to move, but not forward. They moved to cover a retreat. It was not victory, it was barely survival, but it was enough. Under the cover of the Alan cavalry, which formed a rearguard screen between the retreating Byzantines and the pressing Ottoman force, Mousillon began to pull back toward Nicomedia. The Ottoman horsemen pressed them every step of the way, picking off stragglers, cutting down men who fell or stumbled or turned to fight alone without the support of the formation. The road back to Nicomedia was littered with the evidence of what had happened, and the men who walked it, those who survived, walked it in the particular silence of soldiers who have just discovered the exact distance between the world they understood and the world that actually exists. But Osman did not pursue to destruction. This too is important. He could have, why his cavalry was faster than Byzantine infantry. His men were still fresh and coordinated, while the Byzantines were shattered and exhausted, and the gap between Bapheus and Nicomedia was long enough that a hard pursuit might have destroyed the remnant entirely. He did not do it, not because he was merciful, but because he was a builder. Dead men do not farm land. Burned cities are not tax bases. Nicomedia would fall eventually. Of this he had no doubt. There was no need to exhaust his men chasing the last remnants of a force that was already broken. The battle was over. The campaign had been won. The countryside of Bithynia was now, in every practical sense, his. He let them go, and stood on the plain of Bapheus with 5,000 men around him, and looked toward Nicomedia, and beyond it toward Nicaea, and beyond that toward Byrsa, and beyond that toward everything that was coming bright, and he was very quiet for a long moment. Then his men began to cheer. It started in the vanguard units, the riders who had played the bait and survived it and come back to close the trap. men who had been holding their breath for what felt like hours, and now let it out all at once. The sound spread outward through the Ottoman force like fire through dry grass, unit by unit, until the entire plain rang with it, Arabic and Turkish, and the language of the steppe, all tangled together in the single wordless noise that armies make when they have won and they are still alive. Osman sat his horse and let the sound wash over him and did not join it immediately. He was looking at the ground, at the bodies of Byzantine soldiers scattered across the plain like discarded pieces of something that had once been a formation, at the abandoned shields and broken spears and the slow horses that wandered riderless through the aftermath, at the blood already darkening in the dust. Then he looked up, looking east, looking at the sky above Bithynia. The sun was past its height now, beginning its long slide toward the western sea. The light was golden and brutal and indifferent in the way that light always is, careless of what has just happened beneath it. The birds had gone quiet during the battle and were coming back now, small brown shapes moving through the upper air with their usual purposefulness, as if battles were simply weather. Things that happened, things that passed, things to be waited out. Somewhere on the slopes above the plain, a man who had hidden himself in the brush to watch the battle from above, a farmer, maybe, or a shepherd who had simply not had time to get away, was looking at what the Ottomans had done and making a calculation that thousands of people across Bithynia would make in the days and weeks that followed. The empire that had once protected him could not protect him anymore. The force that had come to restore that protection had been broken in a single morning. The men on the plain below him were not going to leave. He began to think about where he might go. This, the quiet decision of a nameless man on a hillside, was, in its way, as important as anything that had happened on the plain below. Because what broke at Bapheus was not just an army. What broke was a belief. The belief that the Byzantine Empire was still a going concern in Bithynia, still capable of sending effective force to defend its people, still present in a way that mattered. Once that belief broke, every farmer, every merchant, every bishop, every small official who had stayed through years of Ottoman raiding because he trusted that Constantinople would eventually restore order, all of them began their own calculations, and most of those calculations ended in the same direction. West, across the strait. Away? In the weeks that followed Bapheus, the countryside of Bithynia emptied in a way that it had not emptied even during the worst of the previous decade's raids, because before, the raids had ended. The raiders had gone back to camp. The farmers had replanted, the merchants had reopened their stalls, the bishops had relaunched their services in cracked but still standing churches. After Bapheus, the raiders did not go back to camp. There was no camp to go back to. There was simply occupation, the settlement of a people who had decided that this land was theirs and were prepared to administer it as such. The Byzantine population of rural Bithynia departed. The Ottoman population arrived. Within a generation, the demographic balance of the region had shifted in a way that 100 years of subsequent Byzantine military effort would not be able to reverse. The battle lasted perhaps half a day. Its consequences lasted centuries. As the afternoon light thickened and the cheering gradually faded into the practical business of the aftermath, the care of wounded, the collection of weapons and horses, the burial of the dead on both sides, Osman walked his horse slowly across the northern edge of the plain, where the fighting had been thickest. He was looking at the ground, not triumphantly, with the particular attention of a man who is already thinking about the next problem. The dead here were mostly Byzantine, infantry soldiers who had held as long as they could and then simply run out of holding. They wore armour of bronze and iron, equipment that was technically more sophisticated than anything his men carried, proof that equipment alone does not determine the outcome of battles fought on ground you don't control with a plan you didn't choose. News of the victory had already gone ahead of him. On fast horses, riding north into Paphlagonia and east into the Beylik territories of interior Anatolia, messengers carried the word. Osman had broken a Byzantine army in the field. The first formal Byzantine military campaign sent specifically to deal with the Ottoman threat had ended in a rout. The empire was not going to be sending another one anytime soon. The door was open, and through that door they came. The plain of Bapheus was quiet by evening. Not peaceful. There is nothing peaceful about the aftermath of a battle, fought in heat and dust, with the wounded still calling, and the dead still being gathered, and the carrion birds already working their way down the food chain of disaster with characteristic efficiency. But quiet in the sense of activity having replaced violence. Men moving through the field with purpose rather than terror, the specific sounds of an army at work rather than an army at war. The casualties on the Byzantine side cannot be given with precision. Pashemir's is characteristically oblique about numbers. He is more comfortable describing the political consequences than enumerating the dead, but he makes clear that the losses were heavy, that the Byzantine capacity to field mobile forces in Bithynia had been essentially destroyed, and that the psychological impact on the survivors was severe. Modern historians who have analysed the engagement estimate that between a quarter and a third of the 2,000 men Muzalan brought to the battle did not return to Nicomedia. 500 to 600 dead, wounded, captured, or simply absorbed into the general chaos of the defeat and never accounted for. In the context of Byzantine military strength in 1302, this was not a large number in absolute terms. It was a catastrophic number in proportional terms because there were no reserves. There was no second army. What Muzalan had brought to Bapheus was essentially all of it. George Muzalan himself survived. He made it back to Nicomedia under the cover of the Alan rearguard, wounded and diminished, and carrying the particular burden of the commander who has done everything correctly within a situation that was already broken before he arrived. His military career effectively ended at Bapheus. He would serve in other capacities in subsequent years, but he would never again command a field force, and history would remember him less as a general than as the man who was present at the moment when Byzantine Bithynia died. Whether that is fair is a question worth asking. He was sent to do an impossible thing with inadequate resources. He did not abandon his men. He extracted a significant portion of them. Given what he had to work with, surviving with as many as he saved might have been the best possible outcome available. But history, as he understood very well, is not graded on a curve. The Byzantine forts and garrisons scattered across the Bithynian countryside received no relief and no instruction. In the days that followed Bapheus, Osman moved through the region with efficiency and speed, consolidating the control he had already established over the open ground, and extending it to the smaller fortified positions that had survived by virtue of their walls alone. The castle of Koyunhisar, Bapheus in Turkish, fell within days of the battle. The coastal town of Gemlik followed. These were not dramatic sieges, they were the natural consequences of what had happened on the plain. Isolated, undersupplied, their lines of communication to Nicomedia cut, and their hope of relief destroyed, the garrisons made the rational decision and either surrendered or withdrew. What they left behind was emptied of its Greek Christian population, with a speed that had not been seen even during the worst years of the previous decades. Before Bapheus, the people of rural Bithynia had endured the Ottoman raids the way you endure bad weather, by waiting for it to pass, by sheltering in place, by trusting that the empire would eventually send enough force to restore order. After Bapheus, they understood that the empire could not send that force. The trust that had kept them in their villages through years of difficulty simply evaporated. They packed what they could carry and headed for Nicomedia or the coast, for ships that would take them across the strait to Thrace, for the European provinces of a shrinking empire that could no longer hold its Asian ones. The roads to the coast were crowded in the weeks following the battle. Byzantine refugees carrying children and household goods, and the portable pieces of their lives, moved toward the water with the weary purposefulness of people who know they are not coming back. Farmers who had worked the same land for generations. Craftsmen whose workshops had occupied the same buildings for 100 years. Priests carrying their most important religious objects, the Eucharistic vessels, and the painted icons that were the visible architecture of a faith that had given this landscape its particular character for nearly 1,000 years. They were leaving all of it. The fields, the workshops, the churches, the cemeteries where their grandparents lay. All of it surrendered to a new reality that had announced itself with Ottoman arrows on a July morning. In Constantinople, the news arrived within days. Emperor Andronicus II received it in the particular way that emperors receive catastrophic news, with the outward composure that rank demands, and the inner terror that honesty would acknowledge. He had sent Musalon. Musalon had failed. Michael IX had already failed at Magnesia. There were no more cards in the deck. Andronicus responded the way desperate governments respond when they have run out of their own solutions. He outsourced the problem. In 1303, barely a year after Bapheus, the Byzantine government contracted the services of the Grand Catalan Company, 6,500 Almogavar mercenaries from Catalonia, veterans of decades of warfare in Spain and Italy, men who were extraordinarily good at fighting and extraordinarily bad at taking direction. Their leader, Roger de Flor, was paid a king's ransom. The Catalans crossed into Anatolia and actually drove the Ottomans back in several engagements. They were good enough soldiers to do that much, but they were also undisciplined, brutally acquisitive, and deeply uninterested in the long-term welfare of the empire that had hired them. They plundered Byzantine settlements as readily as Ottoman ones. They quarrelled with Michael IX, who was responsible for managing them, and found them unmanageable. And in 1305, after a series of tensions that had been building since their arrival, Michael arranged the assassination of Roger de Flor at a Byzantine banquet. The Catalans responded by becoming something very close to an occupying enemy force inside the empire's own territory. They ravaged Thrace for years. They devastated Macedonia and Thessaly. They eventually moved west and conquered Athens, establishing the Catalan Duchy of Athens and Thebes, a bizarre remnant of imperial mismanagement that would last for most of a century. The money spent hiring them, the resources spent repairing the damage they did, the gold diluted to pay for it all. These costs compounded the fiscal crisis of an empire that was already, after Bapheus, beginning to feel the weight of what it had lost. And on the other side of the strait, in Bithynia, Osman was building, quietly, methodically, with the patience that had always been his most underrated weapon. He was not moving fast. He did not need to move fast. Time was on his side now in a way it had never been before Bapheus. Every month that passed saw more Ottoman settlement of the former Byzantine countryside. Every month saw another small fort surrender, another village empty, another patch of Bithynia administered under new rules and new authority. Nicomedia still stood. Nicaea still stood. But they were islands now, fortified islands in a sea that had already changed allegiance, sustained by supply lines that ran across the Bosphorus and grew more fragile with every passing year. Osman had his victory. He had his land. And now he had something more important than either. He had momentum. Halil Inalcik, the great 20th century Ottoman historian, whose work remains the foundation of how we understand the empire's origins, wrote that Bapheus was the moment the Ottomans achieved the characteristics and qualities of a state. This is not a casual observation. Inalchuq spent decades examining the primary sources, the administrative records, the coin evidence, the archival fragments that survived the centuries, and from all of that evidence he arrived at a specific judgment, that before Bapheus, the Ottoman entity was a bey-like, a frontier principality among many, notable primarily for its location and its leader's skill. After Bapheus, it was something else, something that had demonstrated, against the principal surviving regional power, that it could field an organized force, execute a complex tactical plan, win a decisive victory, and exploit that victory with administrative follow-through. That is what states do. That is precisely and only what states do. The proof was in the aftermath. Before Bapheus, Osman had territory. After Bapheus, he had people, not just his own Kai birdsmen and their families, but a continuous wave of newcomers who arrived because the victory had made the Ottoman Principality the most attractive destination in Anatolia for anyone with ambition, faith, or simply the need for solid ground. Ghazi warriors from beyliks across Anatolia came to join the force that had beaten a Byzantine army in the field. Sufi sheikhs established tekkes, teaching lodges, in Osman's territory because his patronage was real and his power was demonstrated. Craftsmen and merchants and farmers from the displaced populations of Bithynia's margins found their way into Ottoman service because they needed a functioning authority to live under, and Osman was providing one. These diverse arrivals began to call themselves, as the EBSCO scholars note, Osmanlis, followers of Osman, not a tribe, not an ethnicity, a political identity built around demonstrated capability and the promise of more of it. This was the Ottoman Empire in embryo, not yet the sophisticated administrative structure that would govern 3 continents, not yet the Janissary core, the elaborate court protocol, the Kanun, the law code, the madrises and mosques and caravanserais, and the whole vast apparatus of an imperial civilization. But the seeds of all of those things were planted in the ground of Bapheus's aftermath, in the decisions Osman made about how to organize the territory he had won and the people who came to him because of it. The Byzantine Empire never recovered the countryside of Bithynia. This needs to be said plainly, without qualification. After 1302, the empire held a diminishing number of walled cities in the region, Nicomedia until 1337, when Osman's son, Orhan, took it after a siege that had been ongoing in various forms for 35 years, Nicaea until 1331. When Nicaea fell, the Byzantine chroniclers noted it with a grief that was not quite shock, because they had seen it coming since the morning of Bapheus. But grief is not diminished by anticipation. The city where the Nicene Creed had been formulated, where the ecumenical council that defined Christian orthodoxy had met, where the Byzantine court had sheltered in exile after the Fourth Crusade, this city was now in Ottoman hands. They renamed it Iznik. They built a madris. They did not destroy it, but it was no longer the place it had been, and the people who had made it what it was were gone. Bursa fell in 1326, the year Osman died. The old bey, who had won Bapheus and spent the following decades building on that victory, died of old age before he could see his longest strategic campaign conclude. His son Orhan received the news of Bursa's surrender at his father's deathbed and reportedly told him. Whether Osman heard, whether he understood, whether in the last hours of his life he was capable of anything more than the slow biological winding down that claims all of us, regardless of what we have built, history does not record. What history records is that he had asked to be buried in Bursa. His tomb is there today, in the city that bears the mark of what he built, surrounded by the architectural legacy of the empire that grew from the bey-like he founded on the plain of Bapheus. 151 years after the battle, in the spring of 1453, the Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Mehmed II, 11 generations removed from the world of Bapheus, ruling an entity that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, surrounded Constantinople with an army the size of which the city had never seen, brought up the great cannon that had been specifically designed to destroy walls that had stood for 1,000 years, and in the early hours of May 29th, broke through the last defences of a city that had been, in every practical sense, dying since the morning of July 27th, 1302. Constantinople fell in a single day with a speed that stunned even those who had been predicting it for generations. Every step of the 151 years that separated Bapheus from the fall of Constantinople was a consequence of what had happened on that plain. The loss of Bithynia, which removed the agricultural base that fed the empire. The demographic transformation that replaced a Greek Christian population with a Turkish Muslim one, severing the human connection between Constantinople and its Anatolian hinterland. The fiscal crisis that followed, which prevented the empire from ever again fielding the kind of force that might have challenged Ottoman expansion at a critical moment. The desperate diplomatic manoeuvres, the hiring of Catalans, the flirtations with Western Crusade, the humiliating appeals to the papacy for help that the papacy was never quite able to deliver. All of these were consequences of Bapheus. Ripples moving outward from the impact point on the plain where Osman had set his trap and Musalon had walked into it. What does it mean then? What philosophical weight does a battle fought between 2,000 men on a forgotten plain in northwestern Turkey carry that makes it worth remembering? It means this: empires do not fall in moments of dramatic catastrophe. They fall in moments of ordinary failure, a relief column that was too small, a mercenary force that was too expensive to be loyal, a commander who was given an impossible task and almost performed it, an emperor who was better suited to theology than to strategy, a bey who was better suited to strategy than to theology, and who had the great good fortune of fighting the former rather than the latter. The Byzantine Empire did not lose Asia Minor because it faced an invincible enemy. It lost Asia Minor because it had spent decades making decisions that looked individually defensible and were collectively fatal. And on the morning of July 27, 1302, all of those decisions arrived at their destination simultaneously. And the Ottoman Empire was born not because of divine favour or inevitable historical force, or the irresistible momentum of a civilization on the rise. It was born because one man on a flat, hot plain in Bithynia had prepared more carefully than the man who came to stop him, had chosen better ground, had recruited more effectively, had understood that the difference between a bey and a sultan, between a tribe and an empire, between a raid and a civilization, was simply the decision to stay. The plain of Bapheus today lies beneath the sprawl of modern Izmit, highways and industrial zones, and the ordinary chaos of a Turkish city that has been inhabited continuously for 3,000 years and shows no particular sign of remembering any of it. There is no monument to the battle, no marker where the Byzantine infantry held their ground, no stone to indicate where the Ottoman flanking force emerged from concealment and changed the world. The ground is flat, the dust is still in July, the same colour it was in 1302, that particular reddish-brown that comes from Anatolian soil baked by a sun that does not moderate itself for history. Centuries have passed. The empire that died here left behind a ghost, a city in the Balkans that still calls itself by its Christian name in some contexts. A church in Constantinople that became a mosque, that became a museum, that became a mosque again. Each transformation a layer of the same long story that started on this plain. The empire that was born here also died eventually in the particular way that empires die when the world they were built for no longer exists. In 1922, 620 years after Bapheus, both of them are gone now. The plain remains. And somewhere in the quiet of a July morning, when the dust rises from the flat ground east of Izmit, and the heat presses down, the way it has always pressed down, and the birds move through the upper air with their usual indifference to human significance. Somewhere in that quiet, if you are very still and very honest with yourself about what happened here, you can almost hear it. The sound of 5,000 horsemen rising from the earth at once, the particular silence that fell just before they moved, the moment when everything that followed became inevitable. On a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1302, on a plain no one has given a proper name to in any language, an empire took its last real breath, and another one took its first. Neither of them knew it yet. But the ground knew. The ground always knows.